and I'm discussing the grammar of war discourse in particular relation to embedded journalism and the agendas surrounding it. My major example was a photo essay by Australian freelance photojournalist Adam Ferguson. Adam has contributed to many established publications such as the New York Times and Time magazine. Adam's main focus for photography is the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, focusing primarily on Western troops' everyday lives and activities. Although Adam does have side projects displaying the locals' point of view, his published work is mainly centred around Western forces. What is interesting about Adam's photography, however, is that he gains access to his subject field by embedding himself with the core of troops and living their lives, eating where they eat, going where they go, and seeing what they see. Adam captures this with his photos and attempts, through the use of filters and lighting, to capture a side of the conflict that is foreign to the observer. The interesting debate around Adam's work, however, is how can a journalist or photographer be objective when they are living exclusively with one side of the conflict? This informs the grammar of war discourse, which I believe can be described and simplified by Winston Churchill's famous quote, "History is written by the victors." This describes that if a conflict is won, then all means and atrocities committed by the victor can be omitted in their retelling of the event. War discourse, however, is how a government or organisation convinces the general public to agree with the war effort and accept the means that they are leading towards a glorified end. It is the language and formats utilised to convey to the public that what is happening is just and required, as well as being successful and justified. How a government intends to achieve this is summarised by Lucan in Information Warfare, the Grammar of Taking War. Nullify rather than conceal undesirable news, control emphasis rather than facts, balance bad news with good, and lie directly only when certain that the lie will not be found out during the course of war. Meaning that it is the government's job to make the war seem as profitable, necessary, and just as possible. In relation to our media example, it is the way in which the soldiers are depicted and represented that portrays selected discourse and attempts to convey one of the four tools of war discourse. These tools are as follows: distraction, complacency, support, and making it relatable. All very self-explanatory. Distracting the public, making them complacent towards the war effort, creating support, and describing relatable events. So what happens though is that the very nature of embedded coverage will produce more decontextualised coverage that focus on specific military units and personnel instead of overarching context and analysts. Fowl 2004. An example to Adams is that he is only depicting the view of the one embedded corps that he is with and the troops that he is deployed with, not giving an overall view of the conflict from both sides. And this informs the paradigms of the media ethicists from the second half of the previous century seem to have been forgotten, meaning that the last 50 years of journalism has been a degrading format. Here's a video clip discussing embedded journalism.
Probably on a par. Fact is, war coverage, combat reporting is very difficult to do. You're on one side, and you obviously have certain patriotic sensitivities on the part of readers, viewers, and listeners, and editors, and political leaders who don't want you to stray too far from that. So, in a case like that, it's hard to provide balanced news, hard to provide news about the other side.
Most of the recent war reporting that we see has been done by reporters, journalists who are embedded with military units. Do you think that compromises the objectivity, the way that the story is presented to the public?
Well, it can give you a good picture of what's happening to troops on the front lines, and that's an important story. But it's not the whole story of the war. The whole story of wars has to do with the larger strategic issues and how planning is executed and how well it's realized. And I think it's worth saying that although we talk about embedded as if it were a new idea, embedding goes way back. Pretty much all wars have had embedded journalism. In World War I, in fact, there was a strong impetus on the part of military leaders to get people like Ernie Pyle and many other reporters on the front line, where they would report good hometown stories about GIs and not necessarily be looking at the larger strategic.
Right. Do you think that it's somehow that has become more controversial, though, in recent conflicts?
So, as that video discusses, embedded journalism is in place to distract, make complacent, support the war, and make it relatable. And as he was discussing with the example of Ernie Pyle and the hometown GIs in the front line, by reading about those stories and the everyday American people that they're about, it conjures up a support and a camaraderie from the reader to support the war and to accept that the government is doing right by being there. And as I was also discussed in the video, is that this is not a new concept. The governments have used the media to gather support for generations, and the TSA side describes how it is not a tool used only by the West either. In a report, The First Casualty, Truth, Lies and Commercial Opportunism in Chinese newspaper during the First Sino-Japanese War, there is an example of how two papers on opposing sides of the conflict were both reciting victories of the same battle. And what this leads to is, as a contemporary example during the despotic dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, is that once the countries were at war with each other, the reporting was skewed to emphasise one particular narrative of freeing Iraqis from the despotic dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and to de-emphasise or outright ignore other stories such as targeted attacks on civilians. Meaning that once the war had started, the only media coverage was focused on stories that were beneficial to the American war effort and that wouldn't describe or show the atrocities of war and the impact on the locals that it was having. And where will this lead is the question. In response to our media examples, the photo essay is doing well to describe the living conditions and the impacts of the war on the soldiers. But as long as embedded journalism exists, we will never get an overall objective view of a war effort, and we will never be able to fulfil our jobs as informed citizens in questioning why are we there and what we're doing right. Thank you.